Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast.
Hello, my name is Bruce.
Hello, Bruce.
It has been 3 weeks since my last fish. On my honour, or may I be chopped up and made into soup.
You're an inspiration to all of us. Amen.
Welcome back to Future Squared, beautiful people. Boy, have I got a treat in store for you today. Lawrence Levy was the CFO of Pixar Animation Studios from 1994 through to 2001. So in Pixar terms, from Toy Story to Monsters, Inc. But he stayed on with a board role until the smash hit Cars in 2006. Lawrence recently put pen to paper on To Pixar and Beyond, My Unlikely Journey with Steve Jobs to Make Entertainment History, which was an Amazon Best Book of 2016 in the business and leadership category. The book chronicles how Steve Jobs called Lawrence out of the blue and persuaded him to join Pixar and turn around a company that was on the verge of failure. Levy worked closely with Jobs and the Pixar team and implemented a roadmap that transformed the sleepy graphics art studio into one of Hollywood's greatest success stories. Today, after a career in Silicon Valley as a lawyer and business executive, Lawrence is a co-founder of Juniper Foundation and now writes and teaches on the topics of Eastern philosophy and meditation. He is especially interested in the intersection of these ideas with the stresses of contemporary life and corporate culture. Listeners of Future Squared will know that I'm a huge fan of Pixar, so I was excited to interview Lawrence and find out more about the early days of the company, how Toy Story almost didn't make it, the challenges behind taking Pixar public, and what kind of person Steve Jobs really was. Lawrence also packs countless punches and delivers key insights on how to balance financial objectives with creativity and innovation, something at the core of what Pixar does, as well as how to build a culture where people are free to fail in order to do, ultimately, their best work. So with that, sit back and enjoy my conversation with the one and only Lawrence Levy. Welcome to the show, Lawrence.
Steve, I'm delighted to be on it.
So you're joining us all the way from the home of Apple in Palo Alto, is that right?
Well, I'm in Palo Alto, California, so it's like the heart of Silicon Valley here.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And I have to say, as a huge Pixar fan, let's just get the most important question out of the way first. What's your favorite Pixar film?
Well, my favorite is probably Finding Nemo, just because I'm a sucker for the father-son story. But as we felt at Pixar, they're kind of all the films are like our children, so I love them all.
Yeah, and I guess Finding Nemo does definitely bring out those paternal instincts in a lot of people. And I guess thanks are in order because, if it wasn't for some of the work you did when you joined Pixar back in 1994, Toy Story and the 17 movies that followed may never have seen the light of day. So tracing your story back, and we can talk about the book in a second, but can you tell us the story of when Steve Jobs first made contact to woo you over to Pixar back in 1994?
Sure. Yeah, this is actually where the book starts anyway. But I was, at that time, I was a business executive in Silicon Valley, and I was working for another startup company that was called Electronics for Imaging. They're still around. And I've been there for a few years, and my phone rang in my office. I pick up the phone, and on the other end of the line, I hear Hi, this is Steve Jobs. I saw your picture in a magazine a couple of years ago, and I thought we might work together someday. I have a little company I'd like to tell you about. And I thought he was talking about Next Computer, which was the company that he was sort of famous for at the time.
Yeah.
But then he said it's Pixar, and inside I was going, what's Pixar? I had barely heard of it, had very little recollection of it, and that's how that whole adventure began.
Fantastic. And you've chronicled, like you said, this adventure in your new book, To Pixar and Beyond, which comes out in Australia this Friday, the 17th of March. It just came out in the UK, and it's been out in the States, I believe, since November. But the UK, the lucky readers in the UK get a much sexier cover, as I was fortunate enough to have a look at a few moments ago. But, you've been working away with Juniper for the past, 13 years now. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but I guess I'm curious to explore what prompted you to put pen to paper and pen To Pixar and Beyond about 11 years after leaving the organization.
Oh, that's actually a great question. There were a couple of things that happened. One was that, after Steve obviously died young, tragically, and there was a whole ton of movies and documentaries and books that were written in the aftermath of his death. And there was a part of me that was sort of feeling that the Pixar story of his life was sort of an afterthought. It was as if he, started at Apple and then left Apple, and then 12 years later he went back to Apple. And I was kind of going, well, wait a minute. This story that happened in the middle was a really important story, both for understanding him and for understanding Pixar. So that was one thing that sort of gnawed away at me a little bit. And I realized that if I didn't tell that story, it probably wouldn't get told. Then the other thing that happened is I had this kind of insight one day a few years ago where I could draw a link between Pixar and the work that I've been doing since, which is all about Eastern philosophy and meditation, and particularly a philosophy called the middle way, which is a sort of a way of living life with a certain kind of harmony. And I could see that I could use Pixar as a metaphor for telling that. And so I put those two things together and I gave it as a talk. I first spoke about it at Harvard Law School, where I had graduated many years before. Then I was invited to talk about it at Pixar. And those things went over really well. And so then I was like, okay, maybe I should write this as a book.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess that's where the and beyond comes from, chronicling the time you've spent researching and teaching Eastern philosophy and meditation to corporates post your departure from Pixar.
That's right. That's the and beyond part of the title, which is that the main part of the story is the story of how we turned Pixar into a major entertainment company, but then it does link it to the work that I did after.
Excellent. So on turning Pixar into a major entertainment company, so Steve Jobs gave you this call back in 1994. You accepted. What did you find when you first joined Pixar?
Well, like joining many startups, it takes a certain amount of naivete to go in there. Sometimes, if you really knew the risks involved in a startup, no startups would probably ever happen. And so what I found when I went in there was very different than what I expected when I walked in. Pixar was doing they were involved in a bunch of different activities. They were making software. They were making commercials, animated commercials. They were doing short films. They had this sort of film project going on called Toy Story. And when I went in, I thought the goal would be, it's funny, it never occurred to me that I was going in there to build an entertainment company. So I thought Pixar was a graphics company, a technology company, and I thought we'd take all these cool technologies at Pixar and we'd build businesses out of them, and they would help offset each other and the risks. So the first thing I understood after a couple of months in there was that strategy had no hope, because the things that I thought could turn into businesses actually didn't have any possibility for scaling. So that was the first big surprise. The second big surprise was that Pixar had a very toxic relationship with Steve. And that toxicity was in some ways rubbed off on me because people thought I was coming in as Steve's guy.
Right.
And so, so their frustrations that they had with him over the years sort of rubbed off on me, which that was okay. bothered me more was the toxicity itself, and I realized that wasn't healthy for the company. And the third problem that I discovered was that Pixar had entered this contract with the Walt Disney Company for the making of Toy Story and several other animated feature films that tied Pixar's hands up to such an extent that it had just no room to move at all. And so 2 months into it, I was pretty convinced I'd made the biggest mistake of my career in terms of going in there.
Wow. There's a few things I wanted to dig deeper on there. And I guess, firstly, on the toxicity and, staff having somewhat of a, I suppose, resentment and mistrust for Steve Jobs. There seems to be, some conflicting stories out there. I know Ed Catmull said that it was a transformed and collaborative Jobs who led Apple to success, not the tyrant played out in films, books, and countless blogs. So, do you explore this topic in your book?
I do. I think that the arc of Steve's sort of progress from the first Apple to second Apple, the important changes of that happened during these few years of Pixar, and there were several things that happened in that time period that I think had a big impact on him. And you see in the book how that toxic relationship was really transformed ultimately to a very productive and very beautiful relationship, actually. And I think the process of that, along with some other things, had a big and important impact on Steve.
It did seem that he mellowed out quite a bit in the latter years of his life. And I remember, and don't quote me on this, but I think when he was on his deathbed, he basically said something along the lines of he wishes he would have spent more time with family. Whereas creating his biopic in the 70s was very much just business, 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 and take no prisoners sort of approach to life.
Yeah, he was very, very focused, no question about it. But my relationship with him was one I would describe as very rich and very collaborative. If you ask me for one word to describe it, I would say it was collaborative. And the reason I say that is because he had certainly an intensity about him when he believed something and he once thought something should be a certain way. It would take a lot to sort of stand up to that if you didn't agree. But he was interested in getting to the right answer more than he was interested in being right.
Right.
And so the process of working together trying to forge a strategy for a company that we really didn't know what direction to go in was one of just sort of debating all sides of the different arguments, and so we could try to get to the right answer.
Yeah, and on Pixar's hands being tied by Disney, effectively, most of our audience are engaged in corporate innovation roles where they're accountable to external stakeholders, whether it could be shareholders, it could be people within the organization as well, and that can often stifle the ability to go out, experiment, be creative, try different things, fail, pick yourself back up, all that sort of stuff. How did Pixar navigate their hands being tied by Disney around the time of Toy Story?
Well, Pixar was a company that sort of honed that kind of capacity by creating a culture that allowed for a degree of openness and harmonization of conflicting forces. And so in the case of Pixar, as is true for many companies, you have these forces that are tugging against each other. So in one direction, you've got like the creative force that just, wants to do amazing creative work at any cost. Right. Then you have technical forces that are saying, wait a minute, we don't have the software, the technology that enables that to happen. And then you have business, forces. An example of the business force would be how often do you make films? From a business point of view, from my side, it's like you can't make them often enough. When I went to Pixar, we were making a film every 4 years, and there was a big debate about how often it should be. I wanted it to be like once a year or more often than that. So the challenge is, can you create a culture that allows all of those tensions to sort of respectfully work with each other in order to come to solutions to those things? If the creative force is sort of too dominant, and then the business considerations may not have enough weight. If the business force is too dominant, the creative considerations might be stifled. And so it's the harmony. That culture is very delicate, and that's what Pixar really honed over the years.
And that's an interesting point around how many movies do you make, being one of those fundamental business questions, and yourself as the CFO back then wanting to make one movie a year, which makes perfect business sense. But if you do make one movie a year, does it then compromise the quality of the movies? And this is, I suppose, an ongoing struggle at many companies who rely on financial metrics like return on investment, internal rate of return when making investment decisions in new ideas, new products, and so on. But those metrics often force us to focus on the short term and can come at the cost of exploring something a little bit more disruptive, a little bit more out of the box. So how did you, as the CFO, kind of balance that, those financial metrics, those business metrics, with releasing awesome films?
Well, I realized, like in the case of Pixar, I felt, and it was very difficult to raise funds to finance the studio because the risks of making animated feature films is just so high that it's very hard to get people to buy into it. And so what I ended up doing was saying, the way to navigate this is to be completely transparent about it. And so when we talk to investors, when we talk to stakeholders, we put out exactly what it was that we were aiming for and exactly what the risks were. We did not sugarcoat the risks. We didn't pretend it was going to be something that it wasn't. And we asked people if they would take that journey with us. And in many ways, it comes down to that. Sometimes you have boards of directors out here in Silicon Valley, for example, that will say, I don't even want to see any profits this year. I want everything invested back in innovation. And so innovation, by definition, requires a very high level of risk because by its own definition, it's something that doesn't really exist. And so it's like creativity. You can't legislate creativity. You can't walk into a room, and say, okay, our goal this week is to make a great story. You can only create the conditions for innovation and creativity to take place. And Pixar was really, really good at that. And I think that it's like the secret sauce is the word is really culture. You have to have a culture of innovation, a culture of creativity. And that sounds kind of soft, like, well, what do you mean culture, right? How do you measure it? How do you know what it is? But that's something that Pixar paid a lot of attention to.
Yeah, and I guess even aligning the expectations of investors with Pixar's goals and saying, hey, you may not get a return on your investment for 5 to 7 years potentially. We may take 4 years to release a movie, but that then does help to create those conditions because you haven't constantly got investors breathing down your neck saying, hey, when's the movie coming out, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Right. That's how we did it. And of course, to do that, the investors have to trust the innovative forces within the company. And so as a corporation, you have to know how good your creative forces are. And if you can trust them to, have the shot at doing really great work. But if you've got people that have a shot at that kind of a thing, then many times stakeholders will want to bet on that.
I guess I wanted to sidestep over to the roadmap you helped to develop at Pixar. You joined in 1994. It's no secret that in 95, Pixar released Toy Story, one of the most successful films that Pixar has released. I think it had something like a $370 million box office take, so it was quite successful. But you needed to effectively implement a roadmap which turned Pixar around. Now, I guess keen to hear a little bit more about that roadmap, but also what were some of the challenges in implementing that roadmap internally? What were some of the hurdles?
Well, there were different parts of that roadmap. Some had to do with how rapidly do we scale up the studio. So that's a question of how can you scale innovation and creativity. And so, as we talked about earlier, we basically modeled out every scenario, a film every 4 years, a film every 3 years, every 2 years, and looked at the different sort of box office scenarios of what it meant. But that really helped to look at sort of how often to release films and then how rapidly we needed to build the studio. One of the scarce resources at Pixar is that the kind of people to do that kind of innovation and creativity are rare. And I think this is a challenge for any company trying to do innovative work, is finding the talent that can do it. And so we created an entire system in order to scour the world for the talent that we needed to scale the company. So that's one example. Another example, and I have a whole chapter on this in the book, because I think it's one of the most difficult decisions that companies face. And that decision is essentially who ultimately has control over its creative decisions. Who, now in Pixar's case, that means control over, the story and the characters in the film. But in any endeavor, whether it's creating a new brand or a new marketing campaign or designing, the label for a bottle, there are a large number of creative decisions. And executives tend to want to have a lot of sort of keep a short leash on those decisions. The reason for that is because creative mistakes are expensive mistakes. When you go halfway down a movie, making of a film, and you realize that it's not working, the main character isn't working out, or a major element of the story isn't going to work, in the case of Pixar, that could be a $20 million mistake to go and fix it. But it's true for any kind of creative decisions. You've got to go pretty far down, then you might realize you're on the wrong track. So at Pixar, what we did was we baked that in. We didn't pretend that we weren't, we'd somehow avoid creative mistakes or creative errors. We assumed that they were going to happen, and we built them into the process. So those are just a couple of examples.
You are a toy! You weren't the real Buzz Lightyear. You're an action figure. You are a child's plaything.
So at this point of the program, I asked Lawrence about the several script rewrites that Toy Story went through, Disney shutting down Toy Story midway through production, and what some of the challenges were to finally getting what became one of the highest grossing box office animations of all time to the cinema screens.
Well, the characters were not likable. The original versions of Woody and Buzz were, especially Woody, was sort of mean spirited and not that appealing, and that's a big problem. And so, but I'll say that there isn't a film that Pixar has made that didn't have that kind of crisis. I don't think, I've almost come to conclude, I don't think it's possible to do really great, creative, innovative work without some crisis along the way where you're kind of like, where you have that feeling like we've lost our way. And the thing is, the thing that happens is, what happens at the moment when you realize that your creative team, your innovative team, has lost its way? What often happens is, at that point, the executives want to take over. So they want to come in and try to prevent, and try to fix it. And the challenge is, and it takes a lot of courage to do this, like to allow your creative people to sort of navigate their way out of it, to give them tools to navigate their way out of it rather than pull the rug from them.
Yeah, and on what you mentioned there about losing our way, I think a lot of startup entrepreneurs refer to this as the trough of despair, where you could be working on something, and some days you feel like there's a lot of momentum, and then you may go through a 2 or 3 week period where nothing seems to be moving, your metrics aren't moving at all, venture capitalists don't want to talk to you, you're not generating any new revenue, and you just question things. And I think that's just part of the creative process. And most successful startups, the idea that eventually ends up finding product market fit, generating revenue, is generally a far cry from the initial sort of nugget or root of an idea that they first had. But it takes that experimentation, that process, to come to that solution.
It does. I wish there was a way to shortcut it. When I started at Pixar, and I saw like it takes 4 to 5 years to make a film, and I said to myself, "Wow, like that's a really long time. Like surely we can shorten that." And when I left Pixar, I was like, "I can't believe we can make a film in only 4 or 5 years."
Love that.
Because I grew respect for that kind of. That creative process, it just needs a process of maturation. It's like a fine wine.
Yeah. And did you find it easy to maintain focus and staff morale when it takes 4 to 5 years to release a film?
I won't say it's easy. I would say various projects are challenged in different ways, but more than anything else, I think that comes down to leadership. Leadership is really, really important in helping a team navigate through the sort of challenges and pitfalls of creativity. So if leadership tends to sort of try to make things seem like it's always rosy and hey, we're doing amazing work and this is just amazing. When you hit a pitfall, it can be hard. But at least in my experience, when leadership is honest and forthcoming, hey, we're trying to take this hill and it's stormy and it's rainy and it's dark and this isn't going to be easy, but we're in it together. Then it's much easier for people to sort of get behind it and kind of, let's do it as a team.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the leadership factor there.
To infinity and beyond!
On Toy Story generating $373 million at the box office, it has effectively paved the way for an IPO. And I know that, like Woody and Buzz Lightyear eventually seeing light of day, the IPO was also fraught with challenges. And I know you talk about this in your book. So what can you tell us about the IPO, some of the challenges faced and how they were overcome?
Yeah, so when I went to my publisher for the book, I told him I was going to make a page turner out of an IPO, and because it really was an adventure. The problem in Pixar's case, and it's not uncommon today even, it was that most investors, they like stability. So they like companies that have steady growth rates, regular earnings, reliable sort of quarterly reports. They like steadiness, reliability, and they don't like surprises. That's obviously well known. Pixar was the opposite of that and by every single measure. You release films, they're completely unpredictable. The revenue streams that they throw off are unpredictable. They're lumpy. They don't have any sort of steady, growth. They just don't have any of the characteristics that investors like. So they make investors really nervous. So, I felt it would therefore be extremely hard to find investors, and especially to find investment banks that would sort of be willing to take the company public. But we didn't really have a choice because animated feature films cost $100 to $150 million to make, and we needed to finance them ourselves, and there was no way to raise that kind of money without going to the equity markets. Banks at that time weren't going to loan us that kind of money, so the equity markets were the only option. And so, it's funny looking back at it, but we had a really hard time finding an investment banker, and I document that story in the book. And even to this day, I felt the investment bankers we found, they really took a risk with Pixar. But I approached it, and I talk about this as well, which is just that, I decided that just to be totally straight and forthcoming about the risks. And because even myself, I didn't want to have investors, sort of buy into something that they thought was, something rosier than it was. On the one hand, this was a bet to sort of change the entertainment industry and remake the field of animated entertainment, to do something that hadn't been done in 2 generations. On the other hand, it was, a long shot. And so we disclosed that. And so I felt, I slept well at night because I knew that we had always been really open with our investors, and those that were involved were happy to be involved. They knew that what they were investing in.
Yeah, and I guess on finding the right investment bankers, it's no different to finding the right venture capitalists who are aligned with the company's mission and objectives. And, I think you tell the story of a couple of bankers from Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs who initially enthused about the prospect of listing Pixar, but then dropped it like a rock.
Dropped it like a rock, much to the chagrin of Steve, because he really dreamed of working with those guys, and had sort of a sense that there were like there was the only 2 investment bankers in the world, kind of a thing. But my take is that money is green, and so it doesn't so much matter who your investment bankers are, as long as you can put together a sort of well thought out, good transaction that people can understand.
Couldn't agree more on that. And look, I wanted to ask one more question on Pixar, and then we'll jump across into the world of Eastern spirituality and philosophy, but
Okay.
on the brain trust, Pixar's noted for developing a brain trust, which essentially was a special group of senior executives, creative minds in the company, where people could get together and just elicit frank feedback. And if a movie essentially sucked, they would say so. How important is it to have these types of checks and balances in place to ensure people don't fall victim to, say, some of the psychological flaws that we all have, that we're all prone to, like jumping to conclusions and, near enough is good enough and that type of thing?
Actually, I've come to conclude over the years that it's virtually impossible to do really great, innovative work without it.
Yeah.
And that one of the banes of doing great work is what we would call confirmation bias, which is that we become so beholden, so vested in our own ideas. We have so much ego in a way that we lose the ability to listen. And then we do one of two things. We either only listen to those people that are sort of affirming our worldview without really giving us any critical feedback, or we're with people that are able to give us good critical feedback, but we're not paying attention to them.
Right.
And I think this is one of the things that people didn't, perhaps may have missed in all those things about Steve, as well as the creators at Pixar, which is that he wanted pushback. He didn't come in and just dictate everything that needed to be done. He was a listener as well, and so he would surround himself with just a few people, but the right people who were able to push back. But it wasn't easy pushing back on him. Because he was vested in his ideas, but you could, and he would listen. And that's been my experience kind of over and over again. And it's the old adage, in order to do that, we have to kind of check the ego at the door. And the challenge is that the very kind of momentum that gives us the drive to do great work, it requires a lot of self-confidence. So that self-confidence works against us when it comes to listening to others to get the feedback that we need. And so it really requires a balance of drive and self-confidence with the ability to yield enough to listen to the right people.
And I think great leaders will always ask their people to challenge them on anything, rather than just agree and say yes, yes, yes all the time, because that then effectively diminishes the likelihood of coming up with really awesome creative work, because you need to be surrounding yourself with all types of different people, different skill sets, different perspectives of the world, but they need to be free to challenge you.
They need to, and it's hard, and it's one of the things that even leaders sometimes have a hard time seeing in themselves, because if you ask a leader this question, many will go, yeah, sure, of course I talk to people and get feedback, but again, it's that sort of confirmation bias, or like living in your own echo chamber. It would be in a modern vernacular for it, which is that you're really only listening to views that are validating your own, rather than really going out there and investigating. It's really an investigation into the validity of your own sort of thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, that's a great lesson there for our audience. On checking your ego at the door, you left Pixar in 2001 to pursue spirituality and Eastern philosophy, two topics that I and many of my former guests say help to underpin or help to, I suppose, stimulate innovation and creativity, especially in a business context. So, I mean, was this an easy transition for you to make back in, the mid or the early 2000s, coming out of the world of Pixar and working with the likes of Steve Jobs in the hustle and bustle of Silicon Valley to embracing spirituality?
No, it wasn't. I stayed on Pixar's board until the sale to Disney in 2006, so I was sort of watching over the company from that side. But no, I took a sabbatical in my day-to-day life that turned to a sort of new direction in life for me, and it came from a certain place. I observed that the sort of corporate mentality, as we've talked about, is very kind of one-dimensional. It's very focused on acquisition and sort of profits at all costs. But there are some great hidden costs to that. One of those hidden costs would be stress. Another would be sort of loss of meaning. Another would be sort of loss of creativity, loss of innovation, kind of a thing. That we can almost be defined by that corporate life. And I felt there was a danger to that. And I saw it, both within corporations and with the way, people experience stress and agitation in their lives. And I had long been interested in Eastern philosophy, meditation, those kinds of ideas. And I decided to go off and explore that. And I'll say, I did it as somewhat of a cynic. So I'm like not easily swayed. It's very easy for me to look at those things and say, there's nothing here. But I felt that there was probably something deep there that might be really helpful for a contemporary culture. And so that's what I did. I studied meditation and Eastern philosophy for what turned out to be several years. And I started a foundation with several other people to bring those ideas to contemporary life. And essentially, in many ways, I proved out the hypothesis that I had, which is that corporate life, creativity, innovation, business life is amazing. It produces so many wonderful things, so much prosperity, so much innovation. But there is a danger of it being too one-dimensional. And we lose a dimension of life that can bring a lot more sort of contentment and meaning. And the idea is not to abandon one for the other, but to integrate both. And, this is what I discovered in these great philosophies of the middle way, which are a sort of an adjunct to meditation. And so I became very, very inspired by that. And now a lot of my work is focused on those ideas.
You mentioned you have validated your hypothesis around the use of meditation in a corporate context. So, what have you found working with corporates for the past 13 years with the Juniper Foundation in terms of the impact on their work? Because it's one thing to go out there and do great work, but it's another for it to be sustainable and for people to genuinely be happy and also to make better decisions. Because if you're not constantly driven by emotion and ego, like we've said, you check your ego out the door, it does open you up to feedback and to exploring lots of different things that perhaps you normally wouldn't do.
It does, although sometimes I think that's a little bit of sort of a red herring in the sense that people ask me this all the time. Like, I need my stress, I need my ego, I need my erratic emotions in order to do great work. Yeah. But I find that, gosh, you can do great work. Great work emanates from a sort of flow, a sort of an inner drive. It doesn't have to be driven by sort of negative emotion, by by sort of fear and stress and paranoia and all of those things. It's really possible to do great things and that are intrinsically rewarding. And so I think the engagement with meditation, the middle way, these ideas, is to kind of get out of these narratives that keep us stuck in a sort of stressful way of being. So we can open ourselves to something else. And we might end up working a little differently, but I think the rewards that come from it can be immense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was Socrates who said emotion clouds or emotion distorts judgment. And if we can take emotion out of the equation, then we're far more likely to respond to any situation, whether in a work or a life context, with reason rather than react with from a place of emotion or ego.
Absolutely. I'll give you an example that I often give sometimes. So, like, I was a business executive, right? And so there's a certain way of being a business executive. Like, there's a whole narrative around being a business executive, and it's great, and it really works well when you're being a business executive. But what about when you're being a husband, a father, an individual, just a person who's alive, a person in the community, a neighbor, all of those things? Sometimes the narrative of business executive, doesn't work so well in those ways. Yeah. And if you're stuck in that narrative, it's as if we're sort of imprisoned by it. And the goal of these ideas is to free us, from those narratives that keep us stuck. So that we don't have to be quite so bound by them. And then that opens us up to almost, breathe a different kind of air, be a different kind of a way. So it's very freeing to sort of not have to be the same actor all the time on the same stage, and that's what I've found over the years anyway.
And on your resignation from Pixar to pursue spirituality, I know Steve Jobs, I mean, it's been chronicled many times, practiced Zen Buddhism, and it's often credited with the simplicity of the first Macintosh and the minimalism and so on. But, I mean, how did he take the news that you were leaving Pixar to pursue spirituality and philosophy?
Well, he was he understood it. He was very sort of empathetic and understanding towards it, and the fact that I was remaining on Pixar's board meant I was, we're going to at least oversee some of the things that needed to be done. But I think he had a great respect for it. At one time, he told me he was glad that one of us was doing it. I mean, he was off, focused on making these incredible products, and I was off kind of doing this stuff, exploring the mountains, so to speak. And but we talked about it a lot, and he was very supportive of it. It's interesting. It's like, spirituality in a word has become, in a way, it's a little bit of a dirty word. It's like a little, new age, or what does it mean, or something like that. right, and all that kind of stuff. But really, it's about just opening up another sort of side to us, right? You could say that all of our experience, the experience that we have, comes from, it's generated by the mind, the brain, whatever we want to call it. And so if we're experiencing hardship, stress, agitation, fear, all of those things, those feelings are coming from inside of us. By the same token, if we want to experience joy, contentment, harmony, well-being, love, just a good feeling of being alive, those also coming from within inside of us. So the challenge is, how do we get from one to the other? If both experiences are coming from inside of us, and we would like a little more of the one that has, sort of more joy and freedom and spontaneity in it, how do we get to that? And this is the reason to engage that kind of exercise in our life, because we have to work at it a little bit. And that's really the function of meditation, is to draw out that side of us. It's like exercising a different muscle. If you think of those parts of the mind as muscles, we have to exercise them.
Yeah, definitely. And what you said there about trying to focus more on the joy instead of the anguish, I suppose there's some overlap there with, what guys like Deepak Chopra, Tony Robbins teach around neuro-linguistic programming, where no external event has meaning other than which you give it.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. And the thing is that these things, it's funny to think of it this way, but like joy is a habit. We have the habit, you have the capacity for it, or we don't. Most of us have the capacity for it, but it's not, we may not have walked the path enough. So we have to sort of exercise that you call it a neural pathway if you want, but we have to sort of exercise that path. And the question is, how are we going to do that? And it's not likely to happen in the normal sort of performance drive of day-to-day life. So we have to create some space to exercise those pathways, just the same way that, if you want stronger muscles and bones, you've got to create some space to exercise.
That's right.
And that's what that side of life is about.
Yeah. I guess these days, guys like Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday are effectively spearheading the Stoicism movement in Silicon Valley. What's your take on Stoicism as a form of, I suppose, centering ourselves, finding that balance in order to go out into the world and do good work and be freer from ego?
Well, I think that any system is a good system for it. I think the challenge with all these things, Stoicism included, is that it's very easy to buy into the ideas. It's very easy to buy into the idea that, simplicity is good, that, controlling erratic emotions is good, that, having harmony in life is good. In a weekend, you could be like, that's a great idea. I want that. The challenge is how to embody it. The reason that I like the sort of meditation tradition that, or at least the Buddhist meditation tradition that I discovered, is because it's very pragmatic about giving us tools to embody those ideas. We just have to practice these things every day, all the time, create these new grooves. And so, I'm in favor of all of these things, but I always look and ask, how do we embody it, make it part of who we are?
Yeah, definitely. And it does come back to that, I suppose, habitual practice, doing something day after day after day to the point where it becomes a habit, that disciplined meditation.
Right. And that's what meditation, in a way, teaches us. I say in meditation, you know what the hardest part of meditation is?
Saying meditation?
No, that could be. The hardest part of meditation is finding 5 minutes a day to do it.
Yeah.
I often say that, like, if you find 5 or 10 minutes a day to just sit, right, and do it, like, that is like 60% of the battle.
Yeah.
Because and then, like, if you've got the 5 or 10 minutes, then you might as well meditate. But the hard part is creating the habit to open up another dimension in our life, because the rush of our life is so strong, and it's so strong today with technology, because no sooner have you woken up than we're attached to sort of emails or message checking. We're checking things right away. How do we put a break on that just for 5 or 10 minutes to let something else in?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a bit of a paradox, because a lot of people who say things like, oh, I haven't got 10 minutes to meditate, or I haven't got time to exercise, are usually the people that need to meditate and exercise the most.
Yes, we all do, and I empathize with that, because I think it's true. And what I say is that we have to fight for that 10 minutes. That's the thing, because the world out there isn't going to give it to us. Yeah. The demands on us from, just the economic demands, professional demands, family demands, community demands, the demands on us are real and strong. And so no one out there is sort of saying, oh, you rarely arrive at work and someone says, did you have your 10 minutes of meditation today? We've got to fight for it and make it sort of a priority. The biggest thing in meditation is like the will to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess we just need to frame it and perceive it as an enabler of doing better work, rather than an investment of time that's taking us away from our creative pursuits or our work.
Oh, I think that's true, although it doesn't necessarily have to be work. It's just a way of enhancing our experience. I don't think, we should necessarily go into meditation to be sort of more productive. I think the clarity it brings would make us more productive. But, one of the problems is we're just so kind of addicted to performance. It's like we're measuring everything. And so I'd sort of say, look, if you're going to spend the 10 minutes a day doing meditation, at least this is the 10 minutes of your day that you don't have to worry about being measured.
Yeah.
So it's not about doing it well. It's sort of not about succeeding or getting likes or whatever the measurement is. It's about being free from that. And so we want to drop our expectation and go into it just saying, okay, for this 10 minutes, I'm going to just let myself be free from all of that.
Yeah. Although I can see a lot of alpha types measuring the amount of minutes they clock up meditating and sharing that onto social media and all sorts of stuff. But that's another story.
It's another story, but I tell you, but that's to miss the point.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just it's really easy to bring all our old habits into it, and that misses the point of it.
You're effectively jumping back into your ego when you need to share. Hey, look at me! I did 10 minutes of meditation.
That's
today.
Right. Yeah.
So not everybody can just up and leave their jobs to pursue a lifestyle of meditation, of Zen. But I mean, what tips do you have for our audience when it comes to taking small steps every day? I mean, we mentioned, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes a day meditating. Is there anything else they can do to tap into that more mindful, their more mindful selves?
It's about, I would say, fight for that 10 minutes or 15 minutes for you. Mm-hmm. In other words, so much of our day is consumed by the needs of sort of what that are being imposed upon us, right? You have so many emails to respond to, so many, Facebook things that you want to respond to, so many demands at work. There are a lot of demands in our life imposed by others, imposed on ourselves. And I would say that's why I love this idea, even just beginning with 10 minutes. Begin with something that is just dedicated to your evolution as a human being. And If that's meditation, great, whatever it is, but some dedicated space, every day where you can just be unbound from all that stuff just for that few minutes. Will create the habit of investing in yourself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if people can invest in things like television and catching a film, they can definitely invest in 10 minutes a day on themselves and opening up their life and improving their experience of life. I do have one more question on Pixar, which I forgot to ask earlier, and then we'll jump into our lightning round. Lawrence?
Okay.
So the question was on failure. And Ed Catmull basically says in Creativity Inc. that trying to avoid failure by outthinking it dooms you to fail. And this is quite common in large organizations where we add layers and layers of complexity to projects, and ultimately it usually results in cost blowouts, schedule blowouts, benefits realization often becomes an afterthought. So, how did Pixar, we mentioned the culture of innovation, but what was done to effectively create a culture of sharing ideas and of embracing failure as a necessary evil when it comes to learning and making those breakthrough sort of ideas?
Yeah, it's all about risk management. Mm-hmm. And so the more that you layer in to control your risk, the less innovative that you're likely to be. It's virtually a direct correlation. So you can build as many safety mechanisms as you want. It's like and the more safety mechanisms that you lay, the great, but you won't see much sort of creativity and innovation. So you have to strip out the safety mechanisms, and that's hard. It feels naked in a way because you're exposed. And Pixar was a company that was able to live with that exposure. So you have to create an enclave in your company or a culture in your company where it's okay to be exposed to that kind of risk. It has to be okay. You have to sort of allow for it. And then not be too upset when it happens, because it will happen.
Yeah.
It happened at Pixar. And by the way, I should say, Pixar has to struggle with this issue all the time. Every time it makes a new film, it's challenged again with the same thing, because there's a danger of sort of running to safety. And you have to sort of be willing to take those risks sort of every time you step up to the plate.
Yeah, and I guess it comes back to that roadmap you were talking about earlier, where you effectively built in the cost of creative mistakes halfway through the writing of a script, or having to rewrite a script several times and all that sort of stuff. So it's built in so that when it does happen, there are no surprises and there is room in the budget or whatever it happens to be to get through that.
Yeah, you build it in terms of your budget, but then it's like the difference between being on a cruise ship and a small sailboat. Like on a cruise ship, it's built to not fail, right? It like in 100 years, every once in 100 years, right? But on a small boat, you have much more risk, but you can explore much more territory. You can discover much more,
That's right.
on a little boat. And so you have to create that feeling of being on a small boat. If it capsizes, you're in the water, you have to right the boat, climb on, dry yourself off, and keep sailing.
Yeah. I love that analogy. That's great, Lawrence. Okay, so you have given our audience a lot of value bombs today, but I can't let you go without throwing you into our lightning round. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Ready to rock and roll.
Let's do this. So question number one is an interesting one, because I feel like you have worked at one of the most exciting, inspiring organizations of our time. But the question is, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company life cycle, so we could go back to the 18th century if we need to, who would it be and why?
Oh my goodness! I would pick any of the great startups. I just think being around innovation is a privilege and an adventure. So I don't know whether it's Ford or IBM or Apple in the early days. Wrestling with innovation and newness is kind of where the excitement is for me.
Yeah. Likewise. Question number two is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Oh my goodness. In all my thing, I would go back to 2,000 years, there was a Buddhist master called Saraha who was absolutely amazing. And I would ask, what do you think of our world today?
Yeah, that's interesting. We've had a few people say that they'd like to ask people from a different time what they'd make of our world. Some people refer to something as recent as their grandparents and saying, hey, what do you think of the world today? Or what do you think of what I've done with my life and that type of thing? So it's quite interesting.
Right.
And finally, the last question is, and maybe we won't talk about meditation for this one, what other rituals or routines do you have that you partake in on a daily basis to stay on top of your game?
Oh, well, I'm very big into exercise. And I was a runner for many years. And then a couple of years ago, I read this book that said, as you age, resistance training becomes more and more important. And I really bought into this idea. And there's a book that's called Younger Next Year. It's kind of an exercise book. But it basically has the thesis that we have this sense that as we age on a sort of like a linear rate, so it's a slow, steady decline from like 45 to 85, something like that. But they've proven that that doesn't have to be. We can actually keep improving ourselves. At the end, eventually, we will lose it all as we ultimately decline. But we can really have a lot of quality of life, just driven from that. And so I bought into this. And so my wife kind of calls me a gym rat now, although I'm not built. If you saw a picture of me, you would see I'm very kind of lean and scrawny. But exercise is become an important part of my life. And I actually think, exercise and meditation, even though they're hard to fit into our lives, they really, really pay off. I mean, they pay off more than a lot of the other things we do.
Yeah, I know.
So at least I hope so. At least that's where I'm putting my money.
Yeah, likewise, and I'm sure that resonates with a lot of our audience. So where can people go to find out a little bit more about yourself, Lawrence, and connect with you? I mean, I understand the book is coming out this Friday in Australia on the 17th of March. That'll be available on Amazon and at all good places that good books are sold. But where can people go to connect with you?
Yeah, you go to my website, which is www.lawrencelevy.com. And on there, you can learn about the book, you can learn about Juniper Foundation, you can learn about me, and you can write to me as well. I love to hear from people, and I always write back.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your stories today. I'm sure the listeners of Future Squared will share this with all of their friends. So thanks again, Lawrence. You've been awesome.
Oh, thanks, Steve. I really enjoyed it.
What a conversation that was. Lawrence dropped so many value bombs. I counted about 10 on corporate innovation and culture, which I will write up in a blog post on the Collective Campus blog in the very, very near future for all of you lucky listeners. Before I go, just wanted to remind you that the Innovation Manager's Handbook, my new book on corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment, is out on March the 28th via Amazon. You can pre-order that book now at the innovationmanagershandbook.com and on Amazon for the price of a coffee. Yes, just the price of a coffee, less than $4. So head over to the innovationmanagershandbook.com to do that. Until next time, hope you enjoyed today's episode with Lawrence Levy, the former CFO of Pixar from 1994 through to 2001. That was one of my favorite conversations thus far. And with that, I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or whatever day it happens to be that you happen to be listening to this. And I will just go on and shut up right now. That's it from me. Future Squared is out.